I observe a profound fracture emerging across the Atlantic alliance structure, one that threatens to unravel 7 decades of carefully constructed institutional dependency. The American president's tariff threats over Greenland represent far more than crude commercial leverage. They signal the deliberate weaponization of economic interdependence against European sovereignty itself. This moment marks the transition from hegemonic leadership to imperial domination, executed through the systematic exploitation of vulnerabilities that European elites themselves created through decades of strategic complacency. This crisis crystallizes what I have been tracking for months: the systematic dismantling of the post-war order through transactional brutality disguised as commercial negotiation. When Washington threatens Copenhagen with economic punishment over Arctic territorial arrangements, we witness the death throes of multilateral diplomacy and the birth of naked imperial coercion between supposed allies. The mask of partnership finally slips, revealing the underlying structure of dependency that has defined transatlantic relations since the Marshall Plan established European subordination as the price of reconstruction. The strategic context reveals layers of accumulated tension that have been building since the pivot towards great power competition began reshaping global architecture in earnest. I analyze how European dependency on American security guarantees created the very vulnerability now being exploited with clinical precision. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, once Europe's shield against Soviet expansion, has become America's lever for extracting compliance on issues entirely divorced from collective defense, transforming alliance obligations into instruments of economic subjugation. The historical architecture proves crucial to understanding this inflection point. European integration proceeded under American oversight, creating supranational institutions that paradoxically weakened rather than strengthened European strategic autonomy. Brussels became a transmission mechanism for Washington's preferences, rather than a platform for independent European power projection. The single market, designed to enhance European competitiveness, instead created vulnerabilities that American economic warfare can exploit systematically. Consider the systematic erosion of European strategic autonomy over the past decade, accelerating dramatically since the Ukraine crisis exposed continental military weakness. From energy dependency on Russian pipelines to technological subordination to American platforms, European capitals have consistently chosen comfort over sovereignty, trading long-term independence for short-term stability. Now, as Arctic resources become central to great power competition, that accumulated dependency transforms into direct subjugation, the dependent becoming the dominated through the patient application of economic leverage. The Danish government finds itself trapped between impossible choices, each pathway leading towards further subordination: submit to American economic blackmail over territorial arrangements, or face isolation from the security architecture that defines its existence as a sovereign entity. This is not diplomacy in any recognizable form, it is the application of imperial pressure through financial strangulation, executed with surgical precision against a nominal ally whose resistance capacity was systematically dismantled through decades of integration into American-dominated institutions. I examine the broader implications for European strategic coherence through the lens of systemic dependency analysis. Germany's industrial export model depends entirely on American market access, creating vulnerabilities that extend far beyond tariff policy into the realm of technological sovereignty. France's African sphere of influence requires American logistical support and intelligence cooperation, making independent action increasingly impossible without Washington's tacit approval. The United Kingdom's financial services sector operates under American regulatory tolerance, transforming London into a transmission mechanism for Federal Reserve monetary policy rather than an independent financial center. Each dependency becomes a pressure point when Washington decides to extract political concessions through economic warfare, creating a vast network of leverage that can be activated selectively to ensure compliance. The beauty of this system lies in its deniability. Economic coercion masquerades as market forces, allowing American officials to maintain plausible distance from what amounts to systematic financial subjugation of allied nations. The Arctic dimension adds geological urgency to this imperial restructuring, transforming resource access into existential competition between great powers. Greenland's rare earth reserves, critical for advanced military systems and renewable energy infrastructure, represent the material foundation of 21st century American control over these resources, whether through formal annexation or economic vassalage, would complete the encirclement of European technological independence, creating dependencies that extend generations into the future. European leaders' condemnation reveals their fundamental powerlessness rather than principled resistance against American unilateralism. Rhetoric without capability becomes mere diplomatic theatre, highlighting the institutional hollowness beneath decades of integration narratives. The European Union lacks coherent mechanisms for responding to American economic aggression against member states, exposing how continental integration proceeded along lines that enhanced rather than reduced collective vulnerability to external pressure. The crisis management response proves equally illuminating. European capitals coordinate their protests through NATO channels, inadvertently legitimizing the very institutional framework being weaponized against them. This demonstrates how deeply American hegemonic structures have penetrated European decision-making processes, creating reflexive deference even when core sovereignty interests are directly threatened by Washington's actions. I observe how this crisis accelerates the collapse of liberal international order mythology with brutal efficiency. The rules-based system never constrained American behavior when vital interests were at stake. It merely provided convenient justification when American preferences aligned with institutional procedures. Now, as multipolar competition intensifies dramatically, Washington abandons even pretense of multilateral consultation, revealing the imperial core beneath liberal democratic rhetoric. The timing proves strategically calculated to maximize European vulnerability while minimizing resistance capacity. European military weakness, demonstrated catastrophically through ammunition shortages in supporting Ukraine, leaves continental capitals with no credible deterrent against American economic coercion. European defense spending remains parasitically dependent on American technological platforms and intelligence architecture, creating circular dependencies that prevent autonomous response capabilities from emerging. Consider the cascading implications across allied relationships worldwide, extending far beyond the immediate Arctic theater. If Washington can threaten tariff warfare against Denmark over territorial arrangements, what prevents similar pressure against Japan over Taiwan Strait policies, or Australia over Papua New Guinea resource extraction rights? The precedent established here will reshape every bilateral relationship within the American sphere of influence, transforming alliance partnerships into tributary relationships governed by Washington's commercial interests rather than strategic necessity. Chinese strategists observe this transatlantic fracture with considerable satisfaction, recognizing opportunities for strategic advancement through European alienation from American leadership. Every American tariff threat against European allies reduces Washington's capacity for coalition building against Beijing's expansion across Eurasia. European capitals, increasingly alienated from American unilateralism, become less reliable partners in containing Chinese technological advancement and Belt and Road infrastructure projects. The financial architecture amplifies American leverage exponentially through mechanisms that most European policymakers still refuse to acknowledge publicly. European banks, dependent on dollar clearing mechanisms controlled by the Federal Reserve and Treasury Department, cannot resist American secondary sanctions or tariff retaliation without facing systemic banking collapse that would dwarf the 2008 financial crisis. This dependency transforms every European capital into a potential hostage when Washington decides to extract political compliance through monetary pressure, creating vulnerabilities that extend far beyond traditional trade relationships. The technical complexity of this financial vassalage deserves careful examination. European central banks hold massive dollar reserves as insurance against currency crises, but these reserves can be frozen instantaneously through American executive action. European multinational corporations depend on dollar financing for global operations, creating exposure to American regulatory jurisdiction regardless of where business is actually conducted. The SWIFT messaging system, dominated by American oversight, can isolate any European institution from global financial flows within hours of a Treasury Department decision. I analyzed 3 potential trajectories emerging from this crisis, each carrying profound implications for global order architecture. First, European submission accompanied by accelerated dependency on American protection, cementing continental vassalage for decades while creating precedents for similar pressure against other regions. This pathway leads towards formal tribute relationships disguised as enhanced partnership agreements, with European sovereignty reduced to ceremonial status. Second, European attempts at strategic autonomy through deepened integration with non-aligned powers including China, Russia, and emerging market blocs, risking catastrophic American retaliation that could trigger global economic warfare. This pathway requires European unity and resolve that current institutional arrangements seem incapable of generating, particularly given how American intelligence penetration of European decision-making structures enables preemptive disruption of autonomous initiatives. Third, fragmentation of European unity as individual states pursue separate accommodations with Washington, creating competitive bidding for American favor while destroying collective bargaining capacity entirely. This pathway appears most likely given historical precedent and current institutional weaknesses, with smaller European states calculating that bilateral submission offers better protection than collective resistance against American economic pressure. Each pathway leads towards the same destination through different routes: the end of European agency in global affairs as an independent variable. Whether through submission or fragmentation, continental Europe loses capacity for independent strategic action, becoming instead a managed periphery within an increasingly centralized American empire. The Arctic becomes American, the Atlantic becomes unipolar, and European sovereignty becomes historical memory rather than political reality. The Greenland crisis exposes the fundamental architecture of contemporary American empire with unprecedented clarity: dependency masquerading as partnership, coercion disguised as cooperation, subjugation presented as alliance solidarity. European leaders finally confront the reality that alliance with Washington means subordination to Washington, regardless of diplomatic language or ceremonial respect accorded to European sensitivities in multilateral forums. The broader implications extend far beyond Arctic territorial arrangements into the realm of civilizational transformation. This represents the moment when American hegemony transitions from consensual leadership based on shared interests towards imperial domination based on structural dependency and economic coercion. The fiction of Western partnership gives way to the reality of American supremacy, with European allies reduced to tribute-paying dependencies, whose independence exists only within parameters defined by Washington's commercial and strategic requirements. I conclude that this moment represents a civilizational inflection point disguised as commercial dispute, marking the definitive end of the Westphalian system within the American sphere of influence. The principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and diplomatic equality, supposedly sacred within the Western alliance, crumble before the crude application of economic dominance backed by financial system control. Europe discovers it has become America's economic colony, with colonization enforced through financial dependency rather than military occupation, creating subjugation that proves more durable than traditional conquest, precisely because it masquerades as voluntary partnership. The Arctic ice melts under climate pressure, revealing geological resources beneath that will reshape global power competition for generations. The Atlantic alliance melts under imperial pressure, revealing hierarchical structures beneath that transform partnership into vassalage, through patient construction of dependency followed by its ruthless exploitation when compliance becomes strategically necessary. This is how empires consolidate control in the 21st century, not through conquest that generates resistance, but through the patient construction of systematic dependency, followed by its calculated activation when political subordination becomes required for imperial coherence.